We're going to discuss Charles de Montesquieu. Oh, Mark, Charles de Montesquieu, what's that, a French restaurant? No, it's not. It's one of the great thinkers, great philosophers, relied on by the framers of your Constitution to give us this republic. And now, more than ever, we need to understand the history that undergirds this society, because it's being screwed up, it's being ruined. And I want you to know what virtually nobody else knows in your neighborhood, in your community, and in this country, about one of the great men with one of the great minds who helped found this nation, Charles de Montesquieu. And from time to time, as you know, I'd like us to dig a little bit more deeply into the history of this country. How did we come to be? Why are we such a miraculous place? You know, I looked over the news today and I said, it's so petty. Let's take an opportunity to use this format in the best way we can and address some of this. And this is the opportunity, I think, if you have children and so forth, call them around, because this is the sort of thing that's not taught in school. Now, one of the things I want to tell you about is a man by the name of Charles de Montesquieu. His name is longer. He had all kinds of awards and honors over the course of his life, but he was a great philosopher. But more than that, he lived from 1689 to 1755, and he had an enormous impact during the constitutional period of this country. Virtually every man at the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia, read Montesquieu. In particular, the Spirit of the Laws. The Spirit of the Laws, I have a copy of the book on my desk at home, on my dining room table with stacks and stacks of books about philosophers and histories and economics and so forth. And this book, in the translation, is about 1,200 pages long. But it is an incredibly important book, and I dare say the vast majority of you were not taught about Montesquieu in high school or college. And if you were, you probably weren't taught the truth about Montesquieu. So he was crucially important the way Locke was, and Cicero and Aristotle and others. But we want to focus on Montesquieu because, again, he was very, very important during the constitutional period, the most widely read philosopher at that time. The pre-constitutional period, the revolutionary period, the most widely read philosopher at the time was said to be John Locke. So let's dig in. This will be fun. If you're interested in learning about that which undergirds this country, as opposed to the usual yap, 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 yap that you'll get on cable and so forth, this will be fun. Montesquieu explains that prior to all these laws that man makes are the laws of nature. This is very, very important. The laws of nature, the state of nature, natural rights. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's borrowed from Locke. Locke borrows it from Cicero. Cicero borrows it from Aristotle. Aristotle borrows it from the Stoics. So this goes way, way back. Greece, Rome, the Western Enlightenment, and of course, our founders. Prior to all these laws are the laws of nature, so named because they derive uniquely from the constitution of our being. To know them well, one must consider a man before the establishment of societies. The laws he would receive in such a state will be the laws of nature. The law that impresses on us the idea of a creator and thereby leads us toward him is the first of the natural laws in importance, though not the first in the order of these laws. Now this is important. And I write about this, and this is from Ameritopia, and I write about this in Liberty and Tyranny as well. And it's this. You look at the Declaration. If you look at the understanding of man and the civil society, before there was a constitution, before there was an America with states and a government and all the rest, they talk about the laws of nature. Now, where do these laws of nature come from? Well, they come from the state of nature. Well, where's the state of nature come from? Read the Declaration. The Creator, God, divine providence. Now, some of you might say, well, that's all well and good, but I don't necessarily believe in God or the supernatural, all these things. That's fine. You don't have to believe in anything. But our society, a civil society, was organized around the principle, around the doctrine, that there's something bigger than man. There's something bigger than lawmaking. There's something bigger than regulations and ordinances. And that is divine providence that gives us unalienable rights, each and every one of us, or what I call the sphere of liberty around each and every one of us. And even if you don't believe in a supernatural or God or have no faith, obviously that's fine, that's up to you. And in our country, that's fine, and that's up to you. But that is what has created the tolerance that exists in our society. That is, unalienable rights apply to everybody, regardless of whether they believe in God or don't, regardless of whether they have a religion or don't, regardless if they have faith or don't. That is the magnificence of the principle, of the doctrine of natural law that goes back. And he goes on, a man in the state of nature would have the faculty of knowing rather than knowledge. It is clear that his first ideas would not be speculative ones. He would think of the preservation of his being before seeking the origin of his being. In other words, existence, individuality, subsistence, survival, stability comes before intellectualism and so forth, although intellectualism does come. He says, such a man would at first feel only his weakness. His timidity would be extreme. In this state, each feels himself inferior. He scarcely feels himself an equal. Such men would not seek to attack one another, and peace would be the first natural law. Not to get too complicated here, but in this he agrees with Locke, and Locke and Montesquieu disagree with Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes says the first inclination of man is war, is to conquer, is violence, and so forth. Locke says, no, that's wrong. The first inclination is survival. And through survival, getting along with people to the extent that's possible. And Montesquieu comes slightly after Locke, agrees with Locke. Montesquieu goes on, he explains, considering as living in a society that must be maintained, they have laws concerning the relation between those who govern and those who are governed. And remember, I'm not giving you all 1,200 pages of the spirit of the laws. We'd be here for about 12 years. What I'm doing is getting into the guts of the matter that I think relates to what's going on today and that undergirds our system. Considering as living in a society that must be maintained, they have laws concerning the relation between those who govern and those who are governed. So we're moving now from the individual, natural law, and so forth, into the notion of, okay, this society, how do we govern ourselves? And he says, and this is the political right. The political right. Further, they have laws concerning the relation that all citizens have with one another. And this is the civil right. You wonder where this phrase civil rights comes from? It comes from Montesquieu. So this political right is the right to, as we'll see later, a representative government with 3 branches and so forth. And the civil right is the right that the individual has that is recognized by that government. Okay? Montesquieu wrote The Nature of Governments. He wrote about them. He said there are 3 kinds of governments: republican, monarchical, with a monarchy, and despotic. To discover the nature of each, he writes, the idea of them held by the least educated of men is sufficient. What he's saying there is, let me dumb this down so even Mark and everybody else can understand. I assume 3 definitions, or rather 3 facts. 1, Republican government is that in which the people as a body, or only a part of the people, have sovereign power. Monarchical government is that in which one alone governs, but by fixed and established laws. Whereas in despotic government, one alone, without law and without rule, draws everything along by his will and caprices. So in Republican government, Montesquieu explains, the people must be able to vote in elections. Quote, a people having sovereign power should do for itself all it can do well. And what it cannot do well, it must do through ministers. Congressmen, parliament, members of parliament, so forth. Ministers do not belong to the people unless the people name them, meaning elect them. Therefore, it is a fundamental maximum of this government that the people should name their ministers, that is, their magistrates. Montesquieu points out, quote, there is this difference between the nature of the government and its principle. The nature is that which makes it what it is, and its principle that which makes it act. The one is its particular structure, and the other is the human passions that set in motion. In other words, the one is the setting up of the institution, and the other is human beings actually functioning within and running the institutions. He explains, there need not be much integrity for a monarchical or despotic government to maintain or sustain itself, because his point is they're corrupt. The force of the law in the one and the princes ever raised armed in the other can rule or contain the whole. As for Republican government, Montesquieu asserts that, quote, in a popular state, there must be an additional spring, which is virtue. Virtue. Every framer of the Constitution who's written letters, who's written essays, talks about this key issue of virtue. John Adams speaks of it over and over and over again. Montesquieu goes on. What I say is confirmed by the entire body of history and is quite in conformity with the nature of things. For it is clear that less virtue is needed in a monarchy, where the one who sees to the execution of laws judges himself above the laws, than in a popular government, where the one who sees to the execution of the laws feels that he is subject to them himself, and that he will bear their weight. But in a popular government, when the laws have ceased to be executed, as this can only come from the corruption of the republic, the state is already lost. The state is already lost. So what are you saying there is, you can have this beautiful republic, you can have these institutions, you can have these men and women who run these institutions, but if they lack virtue, then the republic is dead. Then it doesn't matter. In despotic government, he says, virtue is not at all necessary to it, because it's not virtuous. Montesquieu saw despotism, including its frequent antecedent, anarchy, as a continuing threat to the Republican government. He said, when that virtue ceases, ambition enters those hearts that can admit it, and avarice enters them all. Desires change their objects. That which one used to love, one loves no longer. One was free under the laws, one wants to be free against them. Each citizen is like a slave who has escaped from his master's house. What was a maxim is now called severity. What was a rule is now called constraint. What was vigilance is now called fear. There, frugality, not the desire to possess, is avarice. Formerly, the goods of individuals made up the public treasury. The public treasury has now become the patrimony of individuals. The republic is a cast-off husk. This is a famous line. The republic is a cast-off husk, and its strength is no more than the power of a few citizens and the license of all. You know, a parallel notion here is when we have a federal government where the president says, I'm going to impose a climate agreement on the American people by calling it an executive agreement and bypassing the treaty clause. Another parallel example would be a massive bureaucracy that spits out thousands and thousands of laws without any consent, any check, any balance whatsoever. Then he would argue the republic is a cast-off husk. Its strength is no more than the power of a few citizens. This is where we are today, ladies and gentlemen, and it's getting worse. This is why I'm spending time getting into this. This is one of the great thinkers and writers of the Enlightenment period. Montesquieu warned, quote, in despotic states, the nature of the government requires extreme obedience, and the prince's will, once known, should produce its effect as infallibly as does one ball thrown against another. No tempering, modification, accommodation, terms, alternatives, negotiations, remonstrances, nothing as good or better can be proposed. In other words, it's the law of man, and this man is the prince, and he rules by the iron fist, and nothing else matters. Man is a creature that obeys a creature that wants. He can no more express his fears about a future event than he can blame his lack of success on the caprice of fortune. There men's portion, like beasts, is instinct, obedience, and chastisement. It is useless to counter with natural feelings, respect for a father, tenderness for one's children and women, laws of honor, or the state of one's health. One has received the order, and that is enough. And I point out, yet despite man's preference for liberty, most live under tyranny. And Montesquieu explained that, quote, despite men's love of liberty, despite their hatred of violence, most people are subjected to this type of government. This is easy to understand. In order to form a moderate government, one must combine powers, regulate them, temper them, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. Now, important. This is the man who authored the notion of balance of powers, separation of powers, and checks and balances. This is important. He says, again, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. This is a masterpiece of legislation that chance rarely produces, and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. A masterpiece of legislation that prudence produces, and prudence is rarely allowed to produce. It's chance. That's our Constitution. So exceptional, so remarkable, so unlike anything else that mankind has ever produced. By contrast, a despotic government leaps to view, so to speak. It is uniform throughout, as only passions are needed to establish it. Everyone is good enough for that. So it follows, I point out, that virtue is mostly impossible in a monarchy and non-existent under despotism. But it's crucial to sustain a republican government. Montesquieu. Virtue in a republic is a very simple thing. It is love of the republic. It is a feeling and not a result of knowledge. The lowest man in the state, like the first, can have this feeling. However, virtue alone, I point out, is not enough. Montesquieu. Despotic government has fear as its principle, and not many laws are needed for timid, ignorant, beaten down people. But republican government requires fixed, established laws adopted by the representatives of the people, which create a culture of support for the republic, I point out. Montesquieu, quote, laws must relate to the this is important, laws must relate to the nature and the principle of the government that is established or that one wants to establish, whether those laws form it as do political laws or maintain it as do civil laws. This is important. What he's saying here is the laws that are instituted, including by a Congress, must reflect the nature of the people in that society. In other words, you're not passing laws to brutalize them, to push them, to yank them, to humiliate them, to force them to do things that they don't want to do, assuming the things that are being done are humane and moral and so forth and so on. It is not the object of this, I will call it, representative government or legislature to manipulate the people, because then it ceases to be a representative republic. Montesquieu warns of the tyranny of concentrated power resulting from either unjust laws or the application of laws unjustly, and the anarchy of radical egalitarianism that leads to despotism. He wrote, quote, the principle of democracy is corrupted not only when the spirit of equality is lost, and he doesn't mean the equality of outcomes like modern-day socialism, the equality where we see every person as a human being, as an individual, with unalienable, God-given, remember, natural rights. He says the principle of democracy is corrupted not only when the spirit of equality is lost, but also when the spirit of extreme equality is taken up, and each one wants to be the equal of those chosen to command. So the people, finding intolerable even the power they entrust to the others, want to do everything themselves. He is rejecting pure democracy. Or as Aristotle would call it, mobocracy. He is rejecting mobocracy. May I say in common parlance, he's rejecting populism. to deliberate for the Senate, to execute for the magistrates, and to cast aside all judges. As a result, Montesquieu observed, democracy has to avoid two excesses: the spirit of inequality, which leads to aristocracy or to the government of one alone, and the spirit of extreme equality, which leads it to the despotism of one alone, as the despotism of one alone ends by conquest. And so he's talking about moderate government, as we would call it, the middle course, constitutional republicanism. That's what he's talking about. Now, I want to move on to another aspect of what he talks about, political liberty. Political liberty. Montesquieu wrote this: political liberty in a citizen is that tranquility of spirit which comes from the opinion each one has of his security. And in order for him to have this liberty, the government must be such that one citizen cannot fear another. What he's talking about there is understandable, just laws. Understandable, just laws. So your individual liberty, what we would call it today, or what professors would call it today, positive law. Positive liberty, positive rights. That is, steps taken by an authority, in this case a representative republic or a constitutional republic, that are taken not to deny you of liberty, not to interfere with your liberty, but to try and protect each person's individual liberty. He says, when legislative power is united with okay, hold on now. This is important. This is where Montesquieu gives us a tangible understanding of separation of powers. Separation of powers. This is quoted by the framers often. They spoke about it on the floor of the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1787, in the summer, where they were debating the Constitution and trying to figure out how to create this government. This is important. Political, and it's famous, by the way. Political liberty in a citizen is that tranquility of spirit which comes from the opinion each one has of his security. And in order for him to have this liberty, the government must be such that one citizen cannot fear another citizen. When legislative power is united with the executive power in a single person or a simple body of magistrate, there is no liberty. Because one can fear that the same monarch or senate that makes tyrannical laws will execute them tyrannically. Nor is there liberty if the power of judging is not separate from legislative power and from executive power. You see, separation of powers. If it were joined to legislative power, the power over the life and liberty of the citizens would be arbitrary, for the judge would be the legislator. If it were joined to the executive power, the judge would have the force of an oppressor. All would be lost if the same man or the same body of principal men, either of nobles or of the people, exercise these three powers: that of making the laws, that of executing public resolutions, and that of judging the crimes or the disputes of individuals. This is prophetic. This alone, in my view, raises the level of Montesquieu among the great philosophers, not only during the Enlightenment, but period. Here he is laid out in, of course, very general and ambiguous terms, but good enough. Our Constitution, three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. This is what the framers, among other things, took from Montesquieu. They wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. They debated about it and so forth. But I want you to think about this. I'm not just doing this for academic purposes. You see how important separation of powers is. We're losing separation of powers today. When we have people like Barack Obama who reject the power of the purse, which belongs to Congress, and seize that authority himself, with or without Congress's consent. When people like Barack Obama, a president, seizes the making of treaties from the United States Senate, where 2/3 of the members present are supposed to ratify treaties, and he just says, no, it's an executive agreement, and he rolls on in that sort of way. When a president of the United States says, I have a pen and a phone, and if Congress won't act, I will. or when a president of the United States uses his vast bureaucracy to change society, to direct attacks on particular industries, to subsidize other industries. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when I say the Republic is in decline, the Republic is under attack from within. Exactly what other great men said would happen if America were to decline. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Justice Story, among others. If America is to decline, if America is to be defeated, it's from within. These crucial words and observations by Montesquieu. Unbelievable. Now, Montesquieu said that the government should not force a way upon the people against their will, for to do so is tyranny by legislation. Now, think about that. Here's exactly what he said, quote, "There are two sorts of tyranny. A real one, which consists in the violence of the government, and one of opinion, which is felt when those who govern establish things that run counter to a nation's way of thinking." Wow. Also, it is essential, therefore, I write, that in Republican government, representatives avoid efforts intended to change the general spirit of the nation. That is, the legislator must help preserve and protect society, not eradicate it. As if describing the American people, here's what Montesquieu said, quote, "If there were in the world a nation which had a sociable humor, an openness of heart, a joy of life, a taste and ease in communicating its thoughts, which was lively, pleasant, playful, sometimes imprudent, often indiscreet, and which had with all that courage, generosity, frankness, and a certain point of honor," this is a description of the American people, is it not? "One should avoid disturbing its manners by law in order not to disturb its virtues." Again, the government, even if we elect it, has no right, no authority, and certainly through good judgment, should not try to change the character of the people, the character of a great people, the American people. And yet now we have the Supreme Court on same-sex marriage, and now we have the administration where there's confusion about bathrooms and that sort of thing. Montesquieu would say, no. That's not the American people, and you have no moral, ethical, or any other right, however you come to power, to impose that on the American people. He went on, if the character, that is of the people, if the character is generally good, what difference do a few faults make? The legislature is to follow the spirit of the nation, when doing so is not contrary to the principles of government. But for we do nothing better than what we do freely, and by following our natural genius. If one gives a pedantic spirit to a nation, naturally full of gaiety, the state will gain nothing, either at home or abroad. Let it do frivolous things seriously, and serious things gaily. Now, if change is considered desirable, the manner in which it's to be accomplished is first and foremost through persuasion, not legal coercion and government fiat. Here's what Montesquieu says. We have said that the laws were the particular and precise institutions of the legislator and the mores and manners, the institutions of the nation in general. From this it follows that when one wants to change the mores and manners, one must not change them by laws, as this would appear to be too tyrannical. It would be better to change them by other mores and other manners. In other words, the culture. You should not lord over the culture. The culture shouldn't be driven by government and a relative handful of politicians who have gained power through one form or another. Montesquieu argues that government should not attempt to correct or control all things or intervene in all matters. Government should be limited in its power, scope, and purposes. Here's what he says, quote, "May we be left as we are," said a gentleman of a Republican government. "Nature repairs everything. It has given us a vivacity capable of offending and one apt to make inconsiderate. This same vivacity is corrected by the politeness it brings us, by inspiring us with a taste for the world. May we be left as we are, Our discretions joined to our harmlessness make unsuitable such laws as would curb our social humor. He also points out, and this is very, very important, that laws should reflect the uniqueness of societies. Now, what he means by that is, you hear liberal politicians all the time say, well, in France they do this, or we're the only industrialized country that doesn't do that. What Montesquieu is saying is, well, so what? America is different than France. France is different than England. England's different than Germany. Germany's different than Peru, and so forth and so on. That's good. That's okay. That's as it should be. Montesquieu's concern also is with imprudence, and worse, the danger of Republican government attempting to transform the civil society. I talk often about government trying to devour the civil society, to control it, manipulate it. It is ubiquitous within the civil society. That destroys the civil society. He says that the danger of Republican government attempting to transform the civil society, including superseding the effects of religion, family, commerce, traditions, customs, mores, etc., through legal coercion. In a chapter of The Spirit of the Laws entitled How Some Legislators Have Confused Principles That Govern Men, he writes this: mores and manners are usages that laws have not established, or that they have not been able or have not wanted to establish. The difference between laws and mores is that while laws regulate the actions of the citizen, mores regulate the actions of the man. The difference between mores and manners is that the first are more concerned with internal, and the latter, external conduct. Brilliant man. Now I want to briefly talk about, I've kind of done this already, but I want to do it in a little bit more detail for a little bit, the direct implication and application of what Montesquieu wrote in the Constitution. Because the task faced by the framers of the Constitution was colossal. It made great sense that they would borrow from Charles de Montesquieu in developing a new government. Now, let's talk about some of the specifics. I addressed this briefly. Separation of powers. Clearly one of Montesquieu's most important contributions to our Constitution was his argument in The Spirit of the Laws for separate governing powers and against centralized consolidated authority. Recall what he wrote. Quote, when legislative power is united with executive power, and this is a problem we have today, in a single person or in a simple body of magistracy, there is no liberty. Because one can fear that the same monarch or senate that makes tyrannical laws will execute them tyrannically. So when you have a president, through his bureaucracy or by executive fiat, is making laws and enforcing them or not enforcing them, Montesquieu would say that ceases to be a republic. That's tyranny. He goes on, nor is there liberty if the power of judging is not separate from the legislative power and from the executive power. And I would argue, as a related point, if a judge or justice views his or her role as imposing their personal policy preferences on the people, that is, abusing their lifetime appointments, that's not liberty either. That's tyranny. And Montesquieu would agree, I believe. If it were joined to legislative power, that is, judicial power, the power over the life and liberty of the citizens would be arbitrary, for the judge would be the legislator. And that's my point. We have judges who are legislators and justices who are legislators. I mean, this whole notion of social issues or cultural issues, it appears that the Supreme Court, or a bare majority on the Supreme Court, does not believe the American people are capable, ethical, moral, or prudential enough to make these decisions for themselves. So these lawyers in black robes, as I write in Men in Black, they impose these decisions on us. All of that runs contrary to the Western Enlightenment from which Montesquieu springs. He says, if it were joined to the executive power, meaning judging, the judge could have the force of an oppressor And we've had these oppressors through our history, these judges that order busing and take control of school districts and do other sorts of things. All would be lost if the same man or the same body of principal men, either of nobles or of the people, exercise these three powers, that of making the laws, that of exercising public resolutions, and that of judging the crimes or the disputes of individuals. So what did the delegates to the Constitutional Convention do? Look at the first three articles of the Constitution. The first three articles set forth the division of power in the new federal government. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, quote, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. There's more to Article 1, but that's the beginning. Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America, and so forth. Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Echoing Montesquieu, James Madison, said to be the father of the Constitution. He explained later in Federalist 47 that, quote, the accumulation of all powers legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. He basically pulled that directly from Montesquieu, did he not? And wisely so. Enumerated powers. We have enumerated powers in our Constitution, right? For each of these branches. So I point out even more the delegates were not satisfied that dividing authority was enough to deter the despotism that might result from a central government. So rather than granting wide-ranging authority to each of the three branches to legislate, execute, and adjudicate, the delegates restricted the character of each branch by enumerating the specific powers for the purpose of protecting the liberty and rights of the individual and the sovereignty of the states and generally the civil society. That's what they did. The delegates' actions in limiting the role and scope of the federal branches also comports with Montesquieu's warnings about legislatures in Republican governments abusing their lawmaking power to destroy the nature of man and the civil society. Montesquieu cautioned, I repeat, quote, there are two sorts of tyranny, remember? A real one, which consists in the violence of the government, and one of opinion, which is felt when those who govern establish things that run counter to the nation's way of thinking. The legislator is to follow the spirit of the nation. I'm repeating, when doing so is not contrary to the principles of the government, for we do nothing better than what we do freely as a people and by following our natural genius. When one wants to change the mores and manners of a nation, one must not change them by laws, as this would appear to be too tyrannical. It would be better to change them by other mores and manners, as I pointed out. Nature repairs everything, he writes. May we be left as we are. Our discretion joined to our harmlessness make unsuitable such laws as would curb our social humor. So I am attaching and pointing out that what Montesquieu had written applies directly to the founding of this nation and to the forming of our government through our Constitution. So nonetheless, the constitutional plan was still attacked for not being clear enough about the separate roles of each of the three branches, one from the other. It was still attacked by the anti-federalists. Madison defended it. He said the oracle who is always consulted and cited on this subject is the celebrated Montesquieu. He's mentioned repeatedly in the Federalist Papers. If he be not the author of this inviolable precept in the science of politics, he has the merit at least of displaying and recommending it most effectually to the attention of mankind. Just to show you how brilliant Madison and these men were. He knew Locke had mentioned it, and others had kind of mentioned it, but he also knew Montesquieu gave it really the most tangible and clearest explanation of anybody. Madison, in saying there can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates, or if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers. So he's quoting exactly from the spirit of the laws. He goes on, Montesquieu did not mean that departments ought to have no partial agency in or no control over the acts of each other. His meaning, as his own words import, and still more conclusively as illustrated by the example in his eye, can amount to no more than this, that where the whole power of one department is exercised by the same hands which possess the whole power of another department, the fundamental principles of a free constitution are subverted. So what was happening here? The anti-federalists were saying, look, this isn't really enough, these three separated branches and these enumerated rights. There's overlap. There's overlap. So it's not so clear. And what Madison is saying is there has to be overlap. It can't be so clear. So that was the Federalist argument that won the day. Now let's look at legislators, Montesquieu and the Constitution's framers. In determining the makeup of Congress, after much debate, the delegates agreed to the Great Compromise, offered by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, in which the members of the House of Representatives would be selected on the basis of the population within the states. The members of the Senate would be selected by the states based on equal representation. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1 of your Constitution provides this: the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Although Montesquieu actually favored proportional representation, his observation respecting proportional and equal representation within a national legislature was known to the delegates and obviously influenced their design. Montesquieu wrote this: it is unlikely that the states that associate will be of the same size and have equal power. The Republic of the Lycians was an association of 23 towns. The large ones had 3 votes in the Common Council, the medium-sized ones 2, the small ones 1. The Republic of Holland is composed of 7 provinces, large and small, each having 1 vote. So while they disagree somewhat with Montesquieu in this regard, it wasn't that they were even challenging Montesquieu. They had to figure out, they had states, and they had to figure out how to satisfy the larger states and the smaller states geographically, also the states with the larger populations and the smaller populations. And they came up with a brilliant, brilliant compromise. Sherman did. The Great Compromise. And that is the House of Representatives would be based on population, and the Senate, 2 members from every state, and of course, before the 17th Amendment, the state legislatures would choose the Senate. What about judges? Montesquieu was adamant that a Republican government required a judiciary unencumbered by the political pressures and influences of the legislature, composed when exercising its adjudicative duties. Montesquieu: the power of judging should not be given to a permanent Senate, but should be exercised by persons drawn from the body of the people at certain times of the year, in the manner prescribed by law, to form a tribunal which lasts only as long as necessarily requires. But through tribunals should not be fixed. Judgments should be fixed to such a degree that they are never anything but a precise text of the law. If judgments were the individual opinion of a judge, one would live in this society without knowing precisely what engagements one has contracted. You can see he was extremely hostile to judges who didn't follow the text or intention of the lawmakers. That if you have a judge that simply is imposing his or her personal preferences, then you don't have law, do you? And so in many respects in our country today, we don't have law, do we? Because that's what too darn many judges and justices do. So our Constitution created the Supreme Court and granted Congress the power to create inferior courts, and they did. Federal district courts, the trial courts, and appellate courts. Your first case for appeal, and then maybe you can get to the Supreme Court. Unlikely, because they take so few cases. Article 3, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution, quote, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme Court and inferior court, shall hold their offices during good behavior. So filling the Supreme Court and the lower Article 3 courts would be a joint endeavor under our Constitution between the executive branch and the Senate, again, which was originally intended to represent the states, ensuring that no justice, no judge, would be beholden to one or the other political branches of our government. The brilliance of this. The president would nominate judicial candidates and the Senate would consent or reject them. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 says this: he, the president, shall nominate, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. Let me just address one more issue. Commerce. Commerce. We have this debate about commerce all the time now, don't we? Free market capitalists, socialists, that is statists, and also the national populists. Montesquieu. Montesquieu's view of the beneficial effects of private property and commerce in a republic was also shared by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Montesquieu explained it this way: the spirit of commerce brings with it the spirit of frugality, economy, moderation, work, wisdom, tranquility, order, and rule. Commerce cures destructive prejudices, and it is an almost general rule that everywhere there are gentle mores, there is commerce, and that everywhere there's commerce, there are gentle mores. Again, genius. In other words, the more people who participate in commerce, we today would call it capitalism, and benefit from it, the more there's happiness, stability, and peace, because society has more harmony. In short, he says, one's belief that one's prosperity is more certain in these states makes one undertake everything. And because one believes that one has acquired is secure, one dares to expose it in order to acquire more. Only the means for acquisition are at risk. Now men expect much of their fortune. In other words, private property rights. And people will invest more and work harder and try to even become more successful, because they know that what they have belongs to them. It will be secured by law and the government. Poachers will not be permitted to take from it. The government will not be free to seize it. And so commerce begets more commerce, and commerce begets an improved lifestyle. Indeed, during the Constitutional Convention debates, Madison noted that the predatory and retaliatory taxation visited on some states by their neighbors was an endless source of, quote, dissatisfaction and discord, and resulted in New Jersey, placed between Philadelphia and New York, being likened to a cask tapped at both ends, and North Carolina, between Virginia and South Carolina, to a patient bleeding at both arms, quote, unquote, Madison. The framers adopted language intended to overcome these obstacles to commerce. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, quote, the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, unquote. This clause is often referred to as the Commerce Clause, since it was intended to promote the trading of goods between and among states and eliminate state barriers to interstate commerce, extend prosperity and tranquility throughout the Republic, and regulate commerce with foreign nations and Indian tribes. It's been turned on its head today, at least since the New Deal, where the courts and the left have insisted that the Commerce Clause empowers the federal government to interfere with commerce, to mandate things such as Obamacare and so forth. That has no relationship to the reason for the Commerce Clause, which had at its purpose to promote what we call today free market capitalism. And I will remind you, before the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, there was an attempt to have a meeting of state delegates in Annapolis, Maryland, shortly before. Not enough states sent enough delegates. But the reason that they were wanting to, and some met in Annapolis, was for this specific reason: commerce, to promote commerce between and among the states, because it was being inhibited, and the country was suffering as a result of it, and we were getting our brains beaten out by the British and the French and others when it came to trade And so they said, we need to resolve this. That's the reason for the Commerce Clause. Concomitant with promoting commerce, the Constitution protects private property from seizure by the government without a legitimate public purpose, and fair compensation to the property owner. Did you know this? I know, it's read out of the Constitution, but it's there. As part of the Bill of Rights, Congress approved and the states ratified the Fifth Amendment, which included, quote, the taking clause of the Constitution. Here's what it says. Nor shall private property be taken by the government for public use without just compensation. That's all but been read out of the Constitution of the United States. Now, ladies and gentlemen, obviously there's much more that can be said about Montesquieu. I would like to encourage you to take a look at it in a Meritopia. If you're really desired to dig into this more deeply, you can read it yourself, The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu. It's a heavy lift, but you don't need to read it all at once. Just take your time and go through it. It's a fascinating read by one of the great philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment who had an enormous impact, as you can tell, on the founding of this society. I'm going to continue to do programs like this from time to time because I really feel that this kind of television, this kind of program is lost in cable, it's lost on network news, it's lost on satellite, basically because they're commercial oriented and they're ratings oriented. I'm oriented toward talking to you and you communicating with us about the things that matter in our country and also our history, philosophy, our economic system, and as they relate to what's going on in this country today, which I think is in dire straits. So I want to thank you very much. God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow night.